number 72. 72. Number 235. 235. Song after the announcements and prayer be number 232. 232.
Good evening. This is Robbie Hughes speaking for the congregation. We welcome each of you to our worship service. We especially welcome our visitors and request that you fill out a visitor's card located on the back of the pew. Others serving in our worship are Trent Mabry, who is directing our singing. The opening prayer will be led by Corey Comstock, and Andy Grider will have our closing prayer. Our speaker tonight will be Ron Gilbert. Other announcements: remember the Bible Bowl at Mont Eagle on September the 20th. It begins at 2 p.m. September 20th through the 24th is a gospel meeting at Cowan with Bill Brazier. And then October 4th through the 7th will be our gospel meeting with David B. Smith. Check the bulletin for the list of the sick. Please remember the following: Curtis Smith, Anise Henson's cousin, continues to battle bone cancer. John Haley will be going for diagnosis and treatment tomorrow, so remember them in their travels. And Jack Keefe, Todd Smith's father-in-law, is battling cancer. I worked with a guy named Dennis Turner. His mother went in for a lung biopsy last Friday, and her lung collapsed. And he was real worried about her, so if you would, remember her in your prayers. Now we have the open prayer.
Amen. 232. Our invitation song will be number 125. number 125.
Good evening, brother. Glad you're here. It's good to see you. I have a couple of announcements I failed to write down. I kind of wanted to announce them myself because I know the names of the folks, and there's a couple of individuals I'd like to add to our prayer list. First one name's Quentin Choate. He runs the pit stop out here, mechanic here on next to where Debbie and Sam's business is. He went to Vanderbilt last Monday, and he only has about 18% use of his heart, but they won't put him on a bypass list until he's at 14. So, that's a tough break due to insurance purposes. So if you could remember him, I know a lot of folks around here have a lot of respect for Quentin. For a lot of years he's run that business, and just continue to think about him. And also a fellow by the name of Louis Fuquay, who lives right across from the high school. Bibby Fuquay, most of you in South Pittsburgh, y'all know the family. He has had prostate cancer and has prostate cancer, and he's being treated for that. So if you could remember both those are probably a couple names you may not be familiar with, but both could certainly use our prayers. Also, I failed to mention last Sunday, but the elders, so it had been asked years ago, I had brought up the idea of maybe some men doing some what we'd call talks or sermonettes, however you want to call them, but about a 5-minute, devotional or lesson on Wednesday night. Between the Wednesday night Bible classes and, of course, we sing an invitation song. And if anybody would like to do that, they thought that would be a great idea. It's okay if you tell me that you're going to do it next Wednesday, and then you come up Wednesday night and go, man, I haven't had any time to do that. I'd appreciate a call earlier in the day, but, that's okay too. But this is there for you if you want to exercise that, and I really appreciate that. I started preaching that way. That was, the only access they'd give me to the pulpit. They were pretty smart. Said, oh, boy, won't shut up if we put him up there. We'll tell him he's got 5 minutes, we'll kick him out. And so that's how I started preaching, and so that's a good thing. And it's a lot easier to come up with 5 minutes of material than it is to come up with 35 or 40. So if you'd like to do that, and you're, of course, a Christian, then we would love to give you that opportunity. Now, ladies, that's you can't do that, okay? But we'll set you up a class if you want one. You can have a sermonette over there if you will. But seriously, that's something I failed to mention. And just any time, just any Wednesday night you feel like you'd like to do that, you let me know. Be more than happy to do that. Put yourself in the first century. We looked at Ephesus last week, a couple weeks ago, whenever that was, and we tried to really put ourselves in the mindset of pagan idolatry, and that people really believe that. I mean, just as much as you believe in Jesus Christ and I believe in God, they had been taught and raised about Thor, Odin, and with the Greeks, it was Hercules and Zeus and all those characters. The Romans bit into that a lot. I mean, they put it on their coinage instead of, when they put in God we trust, they would make a plural out of that, and you had to look on the coin to see which one they were talking about. And then, of course, as Rome continued to expand, emperor worship became very popular. And we're going to look at one of the crowning sites, if you will, of emperor worship tonight, which is Smyrna. Smyrna, of course, is the second church listed. And one of the things that's interesting about Smyrna is there is no rebuke whatsoever. One of the two congregations where absolutely nothing is said negative, the other, of course, being the church at Philadelphia. Put yourself in the first century, actually the beginning of the second century. An elder in the Lord's church there named by the name of Polycarp. We know of Polycarp. What he did was made famous by Ignatius, of course, first to acknowledge that Polycarp was an elder there about 120 A.D. Ignatius wrote about that because Polycarp had sat at the feet of the Apostle John. He knew John. It wasn't like he had heard of John or like you and I had read John. Maybe felt like you knew him because you've read the book so many times. He sat at his feet. He knew him. And so that was Ignatius says, hey, here's a guy who sat at the apostles' feet, and he said this about that. And so, that gave it a lot of, pull. Polycarp was executed as emperor worship really took off in the second century from about 120 to about 160. Polycarp is killed. Around 160, he is martyred. He is put to death because of his belief in the Christ. And if I can remember, we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the lesson as well. 86 years old. Now, I've spent some time just this past couple of weeks with at least 3 men that are 86 years old. Some of you may say, hey, I'm there. You know, ain't nothing on me, but I'm just saying, just had the pleasure of doing that this week, 86, 87, 85. And to think of them being hauled out of their house, being taken down to the city square here, if you will, and then a bunch of folks who are antagonistic towards them anyway, it's the Jewish people, say, hey, look, Romans, sun's going down. We can't feed him to the lions. It's against the law. So we hear you're going to burn him. We'll go get the wood. And that's the situation that you have. 86-year-old man, the end of his life, has always been faithful to his Lord and says, you don't even have to tie me up. When they were going to bind him, he says, you don't have to bind me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to run out on the Christ. He never ran out on me. When he was arrested, the Roman, one guy who basically launched the effect, the effort that was really enforcing this, said, if we get there and you'll simply announce that Caesar's God, then all this will go away. You go back home. You can go back to doing your elder thing, and we won't bother you anymore. But you're going to have to do this, or we're going to kill you. And that's exactly what they did. And we made it a point last week, and we're going to stress this as we look at these 7 churches, is the fact that that's happened. That continues to happen. That happened, in the last few hundred years. When you think about what took place, one of my favorite places on earth is St. Augustine, Florida. Spaniards, first set that college, the oldest town in the United States, all that stuff. But there's a bay out there called Matanzas. Matanzas is Indian for blood, bloody massacre. You had the fellow that, made up the compound, did the colony there, who's a Catholic. They came aboard, and, of course, they caught the Huguenots. They caught the French, who had set up a fort in Jacksonville. The French had come down to attack them, but somehow it didn't work out. Well, anyway, they tried to get away, and so he caught them, and he executed over 150 of them. He slit their throats and threw them overboard at what we call the Bay of Matanzas. Right there is on the backside of the coastal waterway before you go back into the ocean. And the Indians had to be checking that out because that's Indian for bloody massacre. They had to be looking at that and going, wow, look at that. That's something else. Those people were killed because they were Christians, not Catholics. And as we look back at we think about Bloody Sunday, I think, or Bloody Thursday or something like that, when 100,000 Huguenots were, again, Protestant, we would say, were destroyed in France. This has been an ongoing thing. And then you throw the Muslim equation in there, this could very well happen again. And even in our own country. That's why it's so important, as we talked about this morning, that we indoctrinate our children and that we fight the good fight. We want our children to be able to grow up in the peace and harmony that we've enjoyed, where we can have meetings like this and worship God and talk about the Bible without having to worry about somebody come in and slit our throats. As gruesome as that sounds, that has happened in the past, and it could happen in the future if you and I don't live the life, practice the doctrine, all the things we talked about this morning. We're going to look at under the angel of the church in Smyrna, of course, right. Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Our theme is going to be to look at the book of Revelations through first century glasses. Remember, these are real letters that John is writing to real people about real circumstances of what had happened, what is happening, and what is going to happen. That which has been, that which is, and that which is to come, as I said in chapter 1. It says, unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saying the protos, the first, and the eschatos, the last. Jesus says, I am the first, the last, which was Nakros, dead, but now I'm Zoe, I am alive. Was dead, but now I'm alive. And the emphasis there, the idea is ruling and reigning. Jesus Christ has been resurrected from the dead. The apostles watched him as he went. John was standing there when he went into heaven. And he's ruling and reigning with God, and that's the emphasis behind that. That's already been illustrated in the first chapter and will really be hammered home in chapter 4 and 5 when we see the Lamb take the book that Almighty God has on the throne and be able to open the seals thereof. The one that stands in the midst with the 7 eyes, all-seeing eyes, and looks like he's been offered as a sacrifice. Verse 9, Jesus says, I know thy ergon, I know thy works and tribulation and poverty. I know what you're going through. but he says, thou art rich. It's amazing how God looks at that differently than how we look at it. He says, I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not. Folks, pick up on that. Because, brethren, as we spoke of this morning, most people who wear the name Christian in our country and throughout the world believe that the Jews, the physical Jews, are saved today. Those who deny the Christ and say the Messiah has not come, our Christian friends say they're saved. They are the fleshly descendants of Abraham. Therefore, if they would just read the book of Romans, Paul says they're not all Israel that are Israel. There's some that have not obeyed the gospel. That's why Paul would warn them. He said, I would give up my own life if I could. I would surrender my own life if my kinsmen could be saved. But they won't hear, they won't obey the gospel. And that's the idea of being cut off, the limb that was cut off, and the Gentiles being grafted in. All of that makes no sense if you're going to say, well, they're saved anyway. Even a Roman Catholic by the name of Bill Buckley Jr., William F. Buckley, when the bishop in Chicago, who basically is over the United States, says, we're not going to evangelize the Jews anymore. They're going to heaven anyway. William F. Buckley wrote him up in the paper and in the Reformer, says, what are you talking about? He said, if it was possible to be saved under the old law, Jesus Christ would not have died. The blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. Jesus himself says, unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. And in order to be a faithful Jew today, you have to deny that Jesus of the first century is the Christ, the Son of the living God. The very thing that Jesus says will cost you your soul. And yet we have people today, remember what we talked about this morning about the Bible. The Bible's very clear in what it says about certain things, and yet they'll do right the opposite. We were studying with Robbie this morning in the miraculous, and that is so amazing to me that because, here we have a clear, let's just take the Catholic Church for a moment. The Catholic Church says, if you want to be a leader in our bunch, then you can't be married. What does the Bible say? Well, if you want to be a leader in our bunch, you got to be married. You got to be the husband of one wife. You've got to have faithful children and not quick to anger and all the requirements that are given to us in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. But what's amazing to me is men have said, no, we're going to do right the opposite. And then when you bring that up to people and say, God has said this is the standard, they'll say, well, no, it's different now. We do it this way. How? You just ignore what God has to say? That's what is happening here. Jesus says the blasphemy of them that say they are Jews, but they're not, but are the synagogue of Satan, synagogue ha satanos. They're working for the devil. These are the devil's people. And yet we have preachers that stand in the pulpits throughout the United States and Europe and that will stand and tell you that the Jews are the fleshly descendant children of God, and he's still maintaining those covenants today, even when Jesus says, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for the remission of sins. Jesus died for this book. Jesus died for the church. He didn't die for the old law. The old law was done away with. And that's what Jesus is pointing out here, those that say they are Jews and are not. Verse 10. Because what does Paul say about Jews? If you're going to be a Jew today, you've got to be a part of the seed promise that was given to Abraham, the Messiah, the Christ. We are the children of Abraham today, people in the Lord's church, people who have surrendered themselves and obeyed the gospel. That is who is saved. It says, fear none of those phobia, fear none of these things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, who's behind it? The devil. The devil shall cast some of you into pholoke, prison, that ye may be tried. You're going to be put through trials. And ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Talk about that when we get there. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Let's look at this very quickly. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that, ever heard of Nike? The swoosh, whatever that is. That's where the word comes from. The Greek word overcome, Nike, victory, to overcome. That's what it says here. He that nakeno, he that overcomes, shall not be hurt of the deuteros, narcos, the second death. Thanatos, excuse me. Second death. You won't die the second death. When I second death, we'll talk about that a little bit as we get to it. Notice here we are in the world, and we're going to hone in again right here above the Mediterranean, right into the Aegean Sea. Blow it up a little bit. The amazing thing about Smyrna is that there is an active city that's right there today. It is the third largest city in all of Turkey, and it is called Izmir today. You can see Istanbul up here, which would be the most prominent city in Greece. Istanbul, of course, was popular from antiquity. It used to be called Constantinople before the Ottoman Empire and the Turks, the Muslim influence in that country. And you'll see some of that as we look. You'll see all the Muslim, towers standing up now instead. So we blow that up a little bit, and you can see right here, this is where Ephesus would be, and about 40 miles north. And the thing that I wanted you to see, and boy, if there ain't a word right there in the middle of that, let me back up. You can't see it. If that wasn't there, you'd see this is the harbor right here. Hopefully you can see my pointer moving. That is the harbor right there, and it is completely surrounded. Very peaceful place. In the worst of storms, you could park your ship in there and ain't nothing going to happen to it. It's going to be in good shape. There's always a wind that comes out of the west, makes it cool in the summer. It was a very beautiful place from what I am told and what I have read. Remember, we're talking about the 7 churches, and we're going to simply make a clockwise. That's how Jesus is going to enumerate them. He's going to start off with Ephesus. Now we're at Smyrna. You can go there today. It's a very active city, about 2.5 million people. And, of course, you have the old part and the new part. I think it would be so cool, like, to live back next door to that. Would that not be neat? You could walk over there and, be where people were. That's just something we don't have in this country. As young people, we don't really get. I probably told you this story before, but I remember one time I never went downtown much when I was in Europe, especially looking for a particular place. But somebody gave me an address, said, you need to go there, and they'll have this, whatever I was looking for. Can't remember what it was. And I had the street address. It was like, I don't know, 15-something, 1534, let's just say. So I'm walking along, and here I see a 1232 or something. Then I cross the street, and it's like 1405, and I'm like, well, what happened to 1300 block, Then I look across the street, and there's one over there that says 11-something, and I'm like, well, this is all messed up, They can't even figure out what blocks are on, these crazy Germans. And then I noticed they had an AD behind them. That's when them buildings were built. 11th, 12th, 13th century. We just don't get that, here. We're, a couple hundred years old, don't have that kind of buildings. But these folks have been around forever. And here you can see those Islamic, the mosque towers. And you cannot, if you live in one of those countries, you may not build a building higher than, the highest one of these. It's against the law. It's kind of interesting seeing how they're so against idolatry, isn't it? Pretty neat, here you have the Agora where you could walk through and stuff. It's a very beautiful city. But if you blow this up, we pull into it, and you look at the modern day, very crowded. It is a very, very populated place. Notice this right here, this little octagon or shaped as we pull in even closer. One of the things, like we talked about Ephesus now, the city that's right where Ephesus was or close by, is some 5 miles from the shoreline. You can see the ancient shoreline has how this just the silt and everything's pushed it out. But one of the things I wanted you to know about this was this right here. It's called the Acropolis. It means just simply the highest point. And one of the things about Smyrna was that when you came up to it, it was an ascending hill that went all the way to a point. And at that point, they had these white buildings all built on this top, and it looked like a crown. And one of the things that you'll see people mention about all the churches of Asia is that Jesus will talk about things that the city's known for. And he will use that as an illustration, such as Laodicea. He talks about, the eyes. They had an eye cream, that was one of their greatest export things. And so he'll talk about, wash your eyes or see with salve. He'll use something about that city to describe what's going on. And here he's going to say the first and the last, because they would say they were the first city of Asia. As a matter of fact, if the Spaniards had discovered this, of course I know we're talking 1,000 years later, but they would probably have named it like they did our state here in the United States, Florida, because they called themselves the blossom or the flower of Asia. But I wanted you to see that because the Lord is going to, you talk about it, I'm going to give you a crown. That city was known for to be able to see that crown that sat on top of that Acropolis. Unfortunately, Corinth was known for a brothel that sat on top of their Acropolis. Of course, they considered that a temple. Notice the 7 letters of the Acropolis, and we're going to keep looking at the Apocalypse, excuse me. We're going to keep looking at this each week. Notice Ephesus was the relaxed church. They'd left their first love. They simply had not stayed where they were and had gotten kind of complacent. Today we're going to look tonight at the Smyrna, the suffering church, tested, tried, and triumphant. We get a word of cheer from a reigning Savior to a suffering church. That's all it's mentioned. That's all Jesus says. Notice at least 7 things that he mentions. Tribulation, poverty, blasphemy. And I know we're only talking 4 verses. One of those is introductory. The other one is salutatory, at the end. And then the other 2 mention these 7 things that this church is going to have to go through. Blasphemy, suffer, prison, tried, then tribulation again. The word tribulation comes from the Greek word thlipsis. Thlipsis means to press. And this particular word comes from a root word, thlibo, which means to press grapes, to press hard. They had this big wheel that they would take if you didn't do it by feet. They had this big wheel, like an olive press, the ideal wine press. They'd use the same thing to get everything they could out of those grapes. They didn't leave, they didn't want to waste anything, just like we don't today. It means to have this tremendous pressure. And Jesus says, I know your tribulation. I know the pressure that's on you. I know how they're threatening your lives. I know how they're threatening your stuff. They're talking about not letting you shop. They're talking about taking what you have. I understand. Jesus says, I know the tribulation that you're going through. I know your poverty, which comes from the Greek word tokia. Tokia, which means beggary, to be weak and afflicted, to be reduced to want, hungry, needing proper place to live, proper food, proper clothing. They were not getting the same opportunities as the folks round about them. They were being held back, if you will. Even the poor people. Now, generally, it's the poor people that accept the gospel. One of the things James says, blessed are they're the poor usually who listen to the gospel instead of the rich. Blasphemy, we practically get that straight out of the Greek, blasphemia, which is the idea of evil speaking or railing against. Thayer says, railing, reveling, slander, detraction. Notice, speech injurious to another's good name. And that's exactly what the Jews were doing. They were telling them Romans, look, you can't trust them Christians. And we know that you've been thinking they're a part of us, but they're not. They're a sect. They're not part of us. They're cannibals. That's right. You talk to them, they'll tell you about eating their Lord's flesh and drinking his blood. They're cannibals. I'm telling you, they're awful. You can't trust them. Here they had the old law, but they've left that. The Jews, they said they were, but they were the synagogue of Satan. They did everything they could to give this up-and-coming church a hard time. They didn't like the church. Remember who Paul's biggest enemy was. He didn't have that much trouble with the Roman authorities, things of that nature. He was chased down, hunted down, to the point of being killed by the Jews. That was the number 1 enemy of the church for the first century and a half. Remember that, brethren, especially as we studied the book of Revelation. They actually encouraged the Roman Empire to start punishing Christians and to get after Christians. They were behind that, as we'll see with one of the greatest or most well-known of all the martyrs of the New Testament, and that would be Polycarp. Polycarp's one of the most famous. And why? Because he was a Christian. And who helped bring the wood? The Jews. And by the way, it was a Sabbath day. Isn't that something? They killed him on a Saturday, and what was the deal about, remember the fellow gathering sticks? And you think they'd have remembered that, but they were more than willing to go get the wood. He says you're going to suffer. You ever heard of the Paschal Lamb? That's the idea of suffering. That's the Greek word. It means to experience a cessation or oppression, feel passion. The passion there is how John would refer to the death of Christ, the passion, hence the movie, The Passion of Christ. Not talking about how passionate he was about something, but that he died. I think we get that from the Latin. And then the idea of prison. They're going to put you in jail. Brethren, I'll be honest with you, one of the big fears I've had all my life is I don't want to go to jail. I have tried to live my life to ensure that I won't go to jail. I sure hope that I don't have to go to jail for preaching the gospel. But I'm telling you what, it's not looking good. It is not looking good. I don't want to go to jail. Jail just doesn't do anything for me. I'll be just quite honest with you. When I go to study with prisoners, and when I'm required, when I've gone to the state penitentiary, when I have gone to the local jails, I am not comfortable. When you hear those doors shut, they're real. They're real doors. I mean, man, they're doors you could kick, but, they're just not going to go anywhere. They scare me. because I'm always afraid they're going to forget I'm in there. But anyway, I don't like doing that, but I'll do that to preach the gospel. But it's not something I like. Imagine having to go to jail because you're a Christian. You know, brethren, the thing that's scary about this is we may not have to imagine that a whole lot. There's a lady in Kentucky right now that can tell you a little bit about going to jail. I would like to think that they treated her very well, and that's just where we are right now, and could be the case. That's going to be the case, and if that is the case, so be it. Thanks to be unto God, the opportunity I have to be able to speak. But they're going to go to prison, that you may be tried. The idea there is parazzo. Parazzo means to test, to examine, to tempt. Of course, Satan's going to be behind this all, as we'll see. The root word here is the idea of a trial. They're going to be tested. They're going to be brought up before magistrates, and they are going to be, in some cases, put to death. Words of cheer. Notice some of the things. As a result of these words of cheer that we have to the suffering church, we have a living Savior that is over all, that knows all, estimating all, foreseeing all, limiting all, cheering all, and promising life at the end of it all. First of all, he's over all. We saw that from the beginning, the protos and the eschatos, the first and the last. Jesus says, I was here in the beginning. As a matter of fact, Colossians with the letter would talk about that he was part of the creation process. John would attest to that as well in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. At the beginning was the Word. And of course, we realize that the Word there in verse 14 became incarnate, dwelt amongst us. That's talking about Christ. There at the beginning, and was part and parcel to and part of the creation process, and now is ruling and reigning. He's not coming back to establish his kingdom. He is in the kingdom now, ruling and reigning. And we are his subjects. We are his slaves, servants, if you will. This brings out his mediatorial dominion over them. Christ is our mediator, first, last. He was dead, but he's not anymore. Brethren, that's our hope. That is our hope. As they saw the Christ ascend back up into heaven, don't you know that inspired the apostles? That's why they would so willingly lay down their lives when they were called to do so. That is why we must be willing to say, listen, you can kill me, but you can't put me in hell. My Savior told me to be afraid of him that can both destroy body and soul in hell. So you can kill me if that's what you need to do, but you can't take away my soul. You can't take away my salvation. Jesus has conquered death, and because he has done that, guess what? We know that it can be done, and God says, I am going to raise you up. God says he is going. Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and where I am, you may be there also. Notice number 2, that our Savior knows all. He says, I know thy works, tribulation. They hadn't written him, but he knew. Brethren, do we realize that Jesus, that God knows right now what we're doing? He knows what we did earlier today. He's got a pretty good idea what you're going to be doing tomorrow. Knows the future, knows the past. That's absolutely amazing to me. God knows what motivates me. He understands why I do the things that I do. That is knowledge too great for me. I know thy works in tribulation and poverty. He says, I know it. Could it be that this church is not rebuked here, that they don't have anything about, hey, listen, you've left your first love, you need to do more work out here and, preaching the gospel. There's just some things. Maybe it's because at this moment, the biggest thing they're trying to do is simply survive. Simply survive. You see, when the church couldn't come together out in the open, I mean, brethren, think about it. If this place burnt down and all of a sudden Christianity became illegal, how would we contact each other? You'd say, you call me on a cell phone. Okay, let's say you don't have a cell phone. But how would we contact each other? How would we get that support and that? To be able to read this, that Jesus knows exactly what you're going through and you're doing a good job. Keep it up. Be thou faithful. Continue to try to encourage each other and continue to try to preach the gospel. That had to be a tremendous boost for them. Jesus knows what's going on. Jesus says, I know your tribulation and your poverty. They're not claiming poverty. Hey, look, we can't do this. We're broke. We don't have anything. He says, I know what you're going through. And you're doing a really fine job with what you've got. You're using everything that you can. What a marvelous. Think if could he say that of us? The stuff we got, the resources that we have, can Jesus say, I know what you're going through, and man, you're doing a great job with what I've given you? Can we say that we're good stewards of what we have? Brother, I think that's just something every one of us could take myself included. Remember when I point a finger, 3 are coming back at me. Self-inventory. Well, the stuff that I have been blessed with, how much of that do I put towards the work of the church? How much do I put towards the glory of God? How much do I put towards trying to help other people see the gospel, see Christ living in me? What did Paul tell the man that used to steal? Steal no more, but work with your hands. So what? You can have more stuff? No. So that you can be able to help others. That slaps me in the head too. I understand that. Today, we have so much in this country, so many riches that we don't really appreciate the fact some folks don't. They're not claiming poverty, but Jesus says, I know it. Estimating all. He says, you think you're poor, but I'm telling you, your estimation's wrong. You're rich. He says, notice James 2 at verse 5, hearken, my beloved brethren, hath not God chosen the poor of this world rich in faith? Isn't that the case most of the time? The people who are receptive to the gospel, the folks that don't have anything. Why is it that the church is growing by leaps and bounds in places like Africa and India and places where folks don't have much? They need hope. And see, when you develop riches and things, a lot of times we trust in those riches and those things. And so the gospel people that are very comfortable don't desire to talk about the Bible. They don't desire to think about the future. They're pretty content with what's going on right now. They're pretty content with what's going on right now. Life is good. How many of us can sit back right now and go, I need to be careful. That's me. Life is good. I've got plenty to eat. We've got plenty to wear. Live in a good place. I control the climate by a little device on the wall. I'm comfortable. We have to be careful, brethren, that we don't become in love with this world. He says, and heirs of the kingdom which he hath promised to them that love him. Jesus says, you're rich. We need to place value on the things that God has placed value. Brother Hughes this morning looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Of course, he was looking at the miraculous element, but he was also looking at when that miraculous element was going to end. Look at what Paul says is important. Look at what God says is important in verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 13. He says, now abideth faith, hope, and charity. This is the greatest. And he says the greatest of these three is love. Yet how often do we consider that to be the greatest thing, love? You start, what's your most prized possession? What's the thing that means most to you? Most of the time we think in material things. I mean, that's the first thing pops in your head, usually. Unless you're a spiritual person and realize, man, I am so thankful that all my kids have, 10 digits on their hands and feet, and we have our health, and they're faithful to God. I mean, how many of us think along those lines? I'm afraid a lot of times we start talking about most prized possession or most thing precious to us. It's a material thing. That's not how God reckons it. And brethren, if we're looking at 1 John 2:15 through 17 and the idea of seeking first the kingdom of God, it's not a way that we need to be looking at it. Not only that, but notice Jesus foresees all. He knows what's going to happen. Don't fear them. Fear none of these things that you're going to suffer. They're working for the devil. He's going to be behind all this. I know this is what you got coming. The Lord has told us, don't fret over it. Understand, it's not pleasant, but it is something that we shall go for. You shall have tribulation. Notice the devil's behind it, and notice who's working for him. His people. He's got men that work for him. And I'm not talking, as we talked this morning in Sunday school, about the angels. I'm talking about men. There are men who do the devil's bidding. Many of them innocently, but many of them, I believe, know exactly what they're doing. How can you not know when the Bible says you need to do this? And you say, I don't think you need to do that. How can you not know that God has said, do this, and you just said with your own mouth, don't do that? Imagine that just for a moment, the idea of once saved, always saved. And then look at yourself in the garden. Here you are, there's that snake climbing down that tree, looks over at Eve and says, if you eat that, you're not going to die. And you say, no, wait a minute. I've read that story. I'm familiar with what's going on here, Eve. Don't you touch that. Don't you eat that, because in the day that you eat that, guess what's going to happen? You're going to fall. And yet we see that very thing happen today when men will stand up and say the the opposite of what God Almighty has said, and people will hold up their hands and say, boy, that's some preaching right there. That man's on the cutting edge. I mean, he is laying it down. He's taking risks. He's showing us new things. Brethren, we need to be beware of that, because that's exactly what's taking place here. You've got him. He's working his employees that you may be tried. Satan tries us for evil. God tries us for our good and can build us up. And I believe that's what's going to happen here. Some are going to survive, obviously. and they're going to be better for it. There's going to be more people obey the gospel by the blood of the martyrs than obey Roman rule to this very day. That's why me and you are here. Remember the idea of the church being purchased with the blood of the saints. Saints shed their blood and were able to bring down an empire without a battle, without a physical battle, but it was a spiritual battle, and many of them would lose their lives. Notice limiting all. He says, don't you worry about this. You're going to have tribulation, but you're going to have it 10 days. Remember what we talked about in chapter 1 with the idea of symbology. As we've looked at apocalyptic literature, 10 very seldom means 10. That's just hard to grasp. 7 usually doesn't mean 7 unless things are enumerated, such as the 7 churches or the 7 vials or the 7 bowls. But generally 7 will have the idea of completeness, such as the week is complete, things of that nature. Well, 10 is a short period of time. It's not a perfect amount of time. It's a short amount of time. And that's the idea. If you were to transliterate that, bring it over into how you would explain that, the idea is a little while. A little while and it'll be over. Paul tries to give us that idea of this momentary stuff we're going through now, but the eternal glory. Remember how Paul contrasts that? Little bit of suffering, great exaltation later on, you know. Little bit of pain here, great glory in heaven. For a little while here, for eternity there. That's the idea here as well. Even if it cost you your life, Jesus said, you're going to be blessed. I'm going to take care of you. There's some things you're going to have to go through. I'm going to try to use you to win over these people who are working for the devil. I'm going to try to use you and your witness and your life to try to show folks that what they're doing is wrong. Some of you will be killed, excuse me, by these wicked people. But they'll look back on that, and they'll be even have more resolve to do what's right. I think one of the motivating factors behind the Apostle Paul's incredible drive to preach and to teach and to go and put himself in harm's way all the time was he could see Stephen's face. Was he could see those women and children being held out in the street, him giving the authority and the right, saying, go get them, they're Christians. I can't help but think he probably slept with that at night and motivated him. That's what's going to be happening here. Jesus says it's going to be over shortly. Hostile powers will rage only as long as God sees fit. Rome thought maybe they were going to live forever, but ask the Germanic tribes, the Goths, how that worked out for them about the 4th century. Not only that, but cheering them on amid all. Fear none of those things. Fear none of those things. Jesus says, you be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life, and last but not least, promising that life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt. You're not going to die. You'll be victorious. Overcome. And overcome sometimes meant dying. And that just kind of you think overcome, you think about being victorious, winning the battle. Jesus says sometimes you win the battle by losing your life. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. You're not going to be hurt by the second death, the idea of second death. There's an underlying principle here behind this word hurt, of an injustice. And there are injustices. Do you remember we're going to see the saints underneath the altar who've been beheaded? And they're going to say, how long, Lord? I mean, we've had a terrible injustice here. We've lost our lives. How long are you going to continue to put up with this? And God's going to say, wait, you're going to have your day. Justice is going to come to these folks, and of course it does. And we'll look at that as we get further in the book. He who is born once, he who is born once will die twice. What's that mean? If you're born but one time into this physical world and you die, you will die again. You die in that state having not been born again, as Jesus would say in John chapter 3, verses 3 through 5. If you're not born again, you will die a second time. The promise of the book of Revelation is, if you're born again, you will not suffer the second death. The second death is referred to as the place where the devil and his angels are. The living Savior, we looked at these 7 things that he's promised. Notice, what about you and I? What about you and I? We quote this verse, chapter 2, verse 10, practically weekly. I do. I mean, I can't think of one that, emphasizes being faithful more. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. But brethren, me and you have a much harder task right now. A lot of us look at that and say, boy, if I could just be a martyr, I'd do it, man. I'd give my life. I'd tell them folks, hey, listen, you need to follow Jesus Christ, him crucified. If you need to kill me, then I martyr myself. Remember, Peter was willing to do that. Shing, boy, he pulls out that sword and says, We got them now, Lord. Let them come on. You know, we're going to take them. I know we're outnumbered 300 to 2 or 300 to 12, but we're going to do it. He starts whacking off people's ears, and Jesus tells him to put away his sword. Well, what are we going to do now? He was ready to give his life. But when it meant having to live for the Christ, that was a lot harder. Meets the little girl at the fire. You know the rest of the story, right? She says, you're one of them disciples of his. No, I'm not. Here we got a man that was drawing his sword, was ready to throw down with 300 guards. Ready to go to war with soldiers now. Ready to go at it. But when it came to standing for that which was right, he's having trouble doing what was right with a little girl standing in front of him. You see, sometimes it's easy to give you life. Just say, you know, mount bayonets and charge. I'd imagine it's pretty easy for them suicide bombers to strap on that junk and walk into a place and blow themselves up. It's what happens the split second after that they'll eternally regret that. For me and you, we are supposed to live the life. That's where it gets hard. That's where it gets hard when our faith is challenged, and that's exactly what's happened here at Smyrna. They're not being killed. Some of them are going to be. Jesus says, stay faithful to it, you're going to be, but living the life. Going through the trials and the tests of being a Christian. Listen, every night it was the news at the 6 o'clock and the 6:30. Attack your faith. Listen, as the country that you thought, you know, we had it figured out what we were doing, tells you that you're all wrong. You never did have it right. This is the way it should have been from the beginning. That's hard. It's hard to listen to the news people that you have respect for, at least you have, tell you that basically you don't have a clue. It's hard to listen to people talk about Jesus like he's Gandhi or Muhammad or any one of these people that have had some type of event. It's hard to listen to that. Me and you are required to, though. You see, we've got to be faithful unto death. We've got to uphold the standard and keep the fight. Be easier just to land on a car bomb, wouldn't it? Be out of here. Our heaven, you know, we're rewarded. That's not how it works. Jesus, the moment you come up out of the water, you obeyed the gospel, doesn't take you out. No, you just now going to work. Man, you've got a lot to do. We've got Christians to make. We've got good lives to influence people and try to save this wicked world in which we're born into. Brethren, that's our job. We're not to be polycarps unless the job calls for it. We are to be faithful to the Christ. We quote this a lot. Is it the point of our lives? Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. Don't miss the point. Don't miss the point why you're here. To fear God, keep his commandments, to have an influence on your family, to be what you can for the Lord, and to help as many of those that you can. Take them with you. Drag them if you have to. That's been my idea. If you're here tonight, you've never obeyed the gospel, we encourage you to do that very thing. We've talked about I don't believe there's anybody in here that hadn't heard me extend the invitation probably 3 or 4 dozen times. You understand what that requires. What we're looking at with these 7 churches is it doesn't stop there. For some, it's just really getting good. Now the work really begins when I've got to live the life and be faithful even unto death. We can help you at all. We encourage you to come. As together we stand and sing. Would you live for Jesus?